Good morning, everyone. Pastor Brett here to go over the common thread for this week's Bible study. And the common thread this week is kind of an interesting one. So, what I saw in these passages as a common thread is the sovereignty of God. And I want to just go through real quickly to show you what I see in each of these passages. So in Isaiah 40, we see this description of a God who is sovereign. And this passage is very clear. God is powerful. He's the one who names the starry host. He's the one who has total control over what happens, over all the forces of nature that are far beyond human control. He is powerful. He's enthroned in heaven. There's this vision of a God who is in control, who is a ruler, like the kings of their day. In Psalm 147, you see a similar theme, this idea that God is worthy of praise because of who he is, because of what he is capable of. Again, the vision is of a God who is very powerful, very majestic, magnificent. However, the same thread underlies the other passages. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians, what you see is Paul talking about his response to God. He says, I do this. I preach to all these people. I have to go. And he says, I don't do it because I'm going to get some great reward. He says, no, I am compelled. I have to do this. The gospel forces me to do it. And again, you see the power of God is ultimately what's in view here, that the Apostle Paul understands his role in light of who God is. That he completely reshapes his imagination about who he is, what he should do, the direction of his life, all of that changes because of who God is. So God's power is sort of like the sun in this view, that everything else orbits around it. And you see a similar thing here in the book of Mark, that Jesus even is in the midst of this powerful ministry, and he takes the time to go get away. And when he comes back, and the disciples find him, and he says, "We've got to go on. That's what I'm here for." So again, the idea that God's intentions and plans, his sovereignty, his rulership, his authority, produce a response. They produce change, actual, real differences in the world around him. So let's look at this idea of sovereignty. The term sovereignty is derived from the word sovereign. That is, it is the sort of property that is possessed by someone who is a sovereign, who is a ruler, who is in total control over a domain. And so this is language of the monarchy, language of kingship, the language of that kind of authority. And so that's where we derive this word. When we talk about sovereignty in a Christian context, we generally mean that God's plans cannot be deferred or dissuaded or stopped or in any way inhibited or hindered by the efforts of humanity. That is, that what God wants to happen will happen. Now, there is debate within Christian circles about how many things God wants to happen. That is, does God determine everything that will happen? Is his sovereign plan a machine that we are all just slotted into? Well, some people think so. Some people think that his sovereign plan is more narrow, more nuanced, that he has specific things that he wants to happen, but he gives humans free rein to make a meaningful choice in other areas. And that's beyond the scope of what we can talk about today. The point that I'm making is when we talk about sovereignty, we're talking about God's plans, whatever they may be, God's intentions, the thing that he says, I want this to happen, cannot be stopped by humanity. And often our view of sovereignty is too small. That is, that we typically view God's sovereignty as applying to things that we want to happen and not applying to things that we don't want to happen. So I can give you an example regarding these last two elections. I know a number of people who said that President Trump was God's appointed president. That is, that they believed that God in his sovereignty had chosen Donald Trump to be president. However, when Donald Trump lost this past election, those same people were quick to call fraud. That is, that they didn't believe that in God's sovereignty he appointed Joe Biden president. And so their view of God's sovereignty was that when God wanted Donald Trump to be president, nothing could stop it. But when God wanted Donald Trump to be president the second time, and it didn't happen because humans were somehow able to thwart it. And so that's kind of a misunderstanding of what we mean by God's sovereignty. And you can see this paralleled in the Old Testament. That is, that people kind of misunderstood God's sovereignty. So the book of Isaiah is a perfect case for this, because it presents this majestic view of God's power, that he calls the stars by names, that he has appointed and ordained all of this, that he is the one who never grows tired and never grows weary. And yet the book of Isaiah is written as the northern kingdom of Israel is going into exile. It covers the span before they go into exile, until they go into exile, and afterwards. So this view of God's sovereignty, this majestic, powerful God, is being written about to people who have just lost their home, who have been carried hundreds of miles to a new place, settled down, and they don't know how long they're going to be there, who are afraid, who are hurting, who have lost family and loved ones. And in the midst of that, they're being told God is in control. You see, the same sovereign God who protected Israel numerous times also decided that they had pushed their limit and that they needed correction. And so they went into exile, and they lost their homeland, and they were punished. But the comfort is that God wasn't thwarted by the Assyrians. God's intention was not that the Israelites would win, but he just wasn't strong enough. God's sovereignty means that God is working in the things that we like and the things that we don't. Let me give you another example. This is not from our readings this week. In the book of 1 Samuel, the first king of Israel is appointed is a man named Saul, and he leads well for a time. But then he begins to reject God's commands, and God removes the kingship from him. Yet God told Samuel to anoint Saul as king. God sovereignly chose Saul to be king, just as he sovereignly chose his successor, King David, who you may have heard of. Who is considered a man after God's own heart, and the one who will possess the rulership of Israel in perpetuity, demonstrated through Christ. So you have, on the one hand, the king who was sovereignly chosen but then rejected, and the other hand, the king who was sovereignly chosen and held up as the prime example of a good monarch for all time. And God sovereignly chose them both. Same in Isaiah. You have God sovereignly choosing to punish Israel, and God sovereignly choosing to provide comfort and tell them that there will be an end to their pain and trouble. In Mark, you have God sovereignly choosing for Jesus to go to this town, and then sovereignly choosing for him to leave in the middle of a fruitful ministry, people who want and need his help. So the takeaway from all of this is that our view of God's sovereignty needs to be not conditioned on what we want to happen. That is, that God will do what God will do. And sometimes we will like it, and sometimes we will not. The other thing, and we can learn this especially by looking at Isaiah and Psalm 147, you see the comfort that the people of Israel found in God's power. Isaiah ends with this offering that everyone will grow weak. Every human will grow weak and tired, but God never will. And those who depend on God for their strength will be renewed. That is, rather than viewing our circumstances and trying to determine God's sovereignty based on our circumstances, we should trust. And that can give us a measure of comfort and peace that in the midst of the worst situation, God can still be working. That however bad things get, God can still be working. That even when the outcomes are not what we would have hoped for, that God can still be working. And that is a comforting thought, because if the success of Christianity, if its growth, if its movement, if its power depends on me, that is a scary prospect, because what if I get tired? What if I mess up? There's comfort to be found in the realization that I am not powerful enough to break God's plan. That I do not have the ability to thwart God. That no matter how badly I mess up, God's plan will prevail. That is good news. So, my friends, I hope that as you go through this week, I hope as you read in the scriptures, you will take note of God's sovereignty, and that you will be able to think of it in the right way, to recognize how vast and powerful God is, far more than we see around us. And I hope you will recognize that in the midst of your challenges, God is still at work. Have a blessed day.